everyone, and welcome back to our little series on the interpretive challenges of Mahler's Ninth Symphony. My name is Ken Woods, and I am the conductor of the English Symphony Orchestra. Now, carrying on from the alliterative theme of episode 1, which we called Mahler's Manners, today we are discussing Mahler's means and methods, by which I mean the way in which he uses instrumentation, orchestration, and notation to help bring his music to life emotionally. The composer Philip Sawyers once said to me that the key to great orchestration is to start with great notes. Mahler certainly knew this, and I would suggest that if you are a fan of Mahler, or if you are skeptical of Mahler, you would still do well to spend a little time comparing one of Mahler's own works in a version for piano versus a version for orchestra. Mahler wrote many of his songs initially as songs for piano and voice, later orchestrating them. And it's fascinating to hear just how powerful and poignant these pieces are when you strip away all the miraculous orchestration. In a way, the orchestration changes the music, but it doesn't necessarily enhance it. There's nothing missing from the original. And where there's nothing missing from the original, the arrangement can bring something new, but not necessarily better. This is interesting for us because, of course, we're performing an arrangement in the upcoming ESO concert. We're doing a reduction by Klaus Simon for solo players, reducing Mahler's orchestra of about 100 down to less than 20. But wherever possible, Simon has tried to keep the original timbres of the melodic lines from Mahler's original. And it's really remarkable that even with such a small group, how close we're able to keep to Mahler's original. Now, this project has really thrown up some interesting questions. Mahler is a composer whose music seems to suit miniaturization very well, and this may surprise many listeners who think of him as the quintessential late romantic giganticist. But it is true that his music works well in small groups, and by now there are chamber versions of all of his symphonies available, in many cases multiple competing chamber versions of all of his symphonies. Why is this? I think it comes back to this idea, first of all, that the notes themselves are interesting, and it also has to do with how Mahler uses the orchestra. It's often been said that Mahler writes for a large orchestra as a variety of chamber ensembles, and this is certainly true, that it's fairly unusual in the course of one of his symphonies to throw the whole kitchen sink at the audience all at once. He uses small groups, lots of solo lines. He divides his string sections between full groups, half groups, two stands, one solo player. And so he's always looking for a variety of combination. And in a way, you can still do that with small forces. But I'm not here to discuss the pluses and minuses of arrangements per se, but to talk a little bit about how Mahler uses instruments in a way that's very unique. Now, Mahler is one of the easiest composers ever to recognize from looking at one of his scores. There are certain telltale signs of a Mahler symphony. There'll be an abundance of grace notes, broken chords, portamentos. You'll see phrases like nicht schleppen, don't schlep, written in abundance on the top of the staff. And you'll see very peculiar markings that not so many other composers use. So for instance, he'll say battute, which means in his case to whap the strings of the instrument with the bow. Colegno battute, hit it with the wood. And sometimes he says just battute, so with the hair of the bow rather than the wood of the bow. Another popular marking of Mahler's, at least it's popular with me, is Schalltrichter auf, or bells up. Now, this brings us on to really interesting territory because many of these markings were considered very controversial for a long time. And if you look at videos, even as recently as, say, Leonard Bernstein's filmed cycle with the Vienna Philharmonic in the 1970s, many orchestras ignored these markings in whole or in part. Things like, put your bell up here, whatever, completely ignored them. And the rationale seemed to be, first of all, that it made the playing more risky for making mistakes, that it made intonation more difficult, and ultimately players would say things along the lines of, well, he's a composer, he doesn't really understand, and if we want it louder, we can just play it louder. By putting the bell up, it doesn't necessarily make it louder. But nowadays, fortunately, I think players are much more excited and willing to engage with these markings. And I think this comes down to arriving at a slightly more nuanced understanding of how Mahler writes things. So when you see something like put your bell up on an oboe or a trumpet or a trombone, of course you think he's trying to call attention to the instrument and make the sound louder by pointing it right out at the audience's head. But as I said, it's still possible to play a trumpet or a trombone in particular louder than you would ever want to hear them without putting the bell up. And I think the very thing that some early musicians were concerned about, that their sound would suffer for playing in this peculiar position, is exactly what Mahler was after. It's not that it wasn't going to be loud enough unless the bell was up, but that he wanted a different kind of sound. And so this is something that I think over the years I've come to believe about Mahler's markings, which is that all markings in Mahler are expressive markings. They're not just sort of instructions to do a thing, but they are requests for a kind of musical expression. So when we see bells up and we know that that sound is going to be harsher, it's going to have more edge, it's going to have more brightness, it's going to be more piercing, and there's an inherent tension in doing it. It makes playing an anaerobic exercise. In other words, you can't play forever in that position. It adds something expressively to the music. It becomes an expressive marking, not simply an instruction to do this. And I think that's true for almost all of these markings that you see littered throughout his scores. Now I'm going to talk in some detail today about Mahler's writing for strings, which is really fascinating. Mahler was a pianist by training, but he was an extremely accomplished professional conductor, maybe the greatest who ever lived. And in the parts of his symphonies, there are tons and tons of bowings, many of which are very eccentric, very, very unusual. Now, just as wind players 20, 30, 40 years ago would look at these instructions and say, Mahler clearly didn't understand the oboe, Mahler clearly didn't understand the horn, I've heard exactly the same thing about Mahler's bowings. He was a composer, he didn't know. He was a pianist, he didn't know. These bowings are crazy, they don't work, they don't make sense. But if we think of Mahler's bowings as expressive markings, I think that's extremely helpful. It's not merely down bow, up bow, but it's part of the key, the clue, the insight into what sort of expression he's looking for in the music. And it's also important to understand that underpinning Mahler's bowings is not only his vast professional experience as a conductor, but also the fact that in many of his works, these bowings are battle-tested by hard-boiled professional musicians. And in fact, during his years in Vienna, Mahler would work on his bowings with Arnold Rose, the concertmaster of the Vienna Philharmonic at the time, and the leader of the world's preeminent string quartet. So these bowings are not the work of a sort of naive composer with limited understanding of the intricacies of string play. These are the results of a collaboration between a very, very great and experienced conductor and a very, very great and experienced orchestral leader. And in his earlier works, we're very, very lucky that we can look at symphonies that he conducted of his own throughout his career and see how the bowings changed and evolved over time, and see how he changed them for different spaces, different halls. So there's a range of possibilities of If you're in a more resonant hall, you might do this. If you're playing in a larger string section, you might do that. For the performances he did with the New York Philharmonic late in his life, he had more strings than he ever had in the Vienna Philharmonic, and some of the bowings did change. Now, in the Ninth Symphony, you're dealing with a different issue, which is that he never had the chance to conduct this work or to work it through with Rosé as he would have. So it has more bowings in it than I think any Mahler symphony, and more completely crazy bowings than any Mahler symphony. You can see both an enormous amount of thought that's gone into the bowing, more than just about any composer or piece I can think of, and yet you can see that the process is not yet complete, that there are many, many, many unanswered questions about how to actually turn these expressive bowing marks into practical bowing marks. So what is an expressive bowing mark? It might mean that when a composer like Mahler writes a down bow, he doesn't simply mean that he wants everyone to play down bow, but he wants the expression that tends to come with a down bow. That's not to say that a good string player can't get something close to the same expression on an up bow, but Mahler is saying that it's that feeling that he's after. And after perhaps a performance, then he knows that that's also the way in which he can best achieve that kind of expression. So we're going to take a look at a few little very simple examples of Mahler's miraculous and contradictory markings in the last movement of the Ninth Symphony today. And I think what you'll find is that yes, they can be contradictory, and in some cases they can even be impossible. But just because something in music is impossible doesn't mean that it's ineffective. Yes, so many of these things that Mahler is getting at may not make literal or factual or practical sense, but the attempt to make sense of them adds something expressively to the music, as I hope you'll see in a few minutes. All right, here we are. Now, I'm going to look at a few little bits of the last movement of Mahler's Ninth Symphony, just some really simple things to give you an idea of the sort of conundrums that we have to work through in making sense of Mahler's bowings. But what I want to stress above all is that we should work through them, that we shouldn't simply ignore them. They may be contradictory, they may be infuriating, they may be impractical, but they're the work of a genius who knew his craft inside and out, and they can tell us an enormous amount. Now, on the surface, certain elements of string playing, particularly bowing, seem very binary. This is down bow and up bow, so two possible directions. And there's basically then the question of, is it one note per bow, or do we slur things together? So when we talk about a slur, it's like a melisma in singing. Two to infinity number of notes under one bow. And that's basically what we work with. Down bow, up bow, separate bows, or slurs. What's fascinating about Mahler is that a slur is not necessarily a slur, and it's entirely possible that a down bow or an up bow is not necessarily a down bow or an up bow, especially in this piece because he didn't live to perform it. All right, so I'm going to look a little bit at just one very short bit of the last movement of Mahler 9, just to explore some of the expressive ways in which Mahler uses the bowing to bring the music to life. Now, in this passage, which starts at bar 13, the first violins and the violas are playing essentially in unison, but they have different expressive markings. This is very common in Mahler. He often has sections playing with exactly the same notes, one in crescendo, one in diminuendo, and it goes through all his music. In this case, they have very, very similar dynamic markings. There's one accent in the violas that's not in the first violins, and I think there's one accent in the first violins that's not in the violas. But otherwise, they're essentially the same. But the expressive bowings are different. So the first violins start with a broken chord and a slur to a minim. But as I hinted a moment ago, a slur in Mahler is not necessarily a slur. And sure enough, he indicates here that we should change bow in the slur. And that in the minim, we should also change bow. Now, these are sort of controversial things. So why does he want us to change bow? Is it like the Charles Richter question? Surely we can play loud enough without changing bow. In fact, a good player can probably play, in this instance, louder without the bow change. Certainly in the minim. It's not super slow here, and it's only forte. You'd think maybe that's more legato, more sostenuto. If I change the bow, is there a little clunk when I change bow? Yes, there it is. Does that disrupt the sense of it being a single note? Do you lose something from the slur? Players worry about these things. They want to get it right. On the other hand, these sorts of bow changes under slurs and on single notes are an integral part of Mahler's style. And as an experienced professional performer, he would have known that when you change bow, there's invariably a break in the sound. We go to school for years to learn how to minimize that break, but there's going to be a break. He would have known that changing bow in a slur breaks some of the lyricism of the slur. But this, what I call overbowing, has an expressive intensity of its own. And I think that's really the point. That often it's not that he wants it to be louder any more than he wants something bells up to be louder, but he wants a different kind of expression, a more fevered, more hyperkinetic expression that you get with the bow change. And in fact, even with solo players, when the bow change will be more obvious, in fact, I think you still get something emotionally from the sort of frantic changing of the bows. And there are places in this piece where his suggested bowing feels very frantic and over busy. So, first violins have that. A change in a slur, a change in a long note, then a slide. And there's a grace note, an accent, and a slide down. Now, here's another example of things that might be impossible but not ineffective. This glissando that I just played, it's not really possible in this register to do it without a break. I have to slide down and skip over. I could play it all on the D string, but that would mean the whole phrase would be softer, and is that a trade-off worth making? We do this all the time in Mahler, fudging the difference between a full slide and a partial slide. Audience can almost never tell, and for most of these it's a vocal portamento that he's after, and not so important that it goes the whole distance. Now the violas have more or less exactly the same notes without any grace notes and without any slides, and very slightly different bowings that are very interesting. So again, the chord, bow change under slur, bow change into a minim, but then it slurs into the next bar, and that's really cool, because where the first violins are intensifying the sound by sliding from one bar to the next with a grace note, the violas are intensifying the sound in a different way by holding through, by tying across the bar line. other thing that means is that while the first violin bow change is likely to be very early, the bow change in the violas is likely to be very late. Because they've got longer to live on that up bow. Yeah? So that worry that we have about the interruption of the long note, especially with solo players, actually he's sort of already thought it out. By staggering the bow change between the two sections, he makes the bow change less obvious while keeping the intensity of the overbowing. And he finds two different ways to connect through the bar line. So the first violins end up with an accent on an up bow here, and a slide. Yeah. The violas come through on an up bow, and no accent, but they land down bow. So it's fascinating. He seems to have really thought through how, by varying the bowings and the expressive markings between the two parts playing this musical line, it'll end up being even more intense. Now, just to carry on to the next little section, there's any number of things in here that don't, as we say for string players, work out. So for instance, similar passage, first violins had this. So that's full of contradictions. I mean, does he really want a retake? I don't know. Violas are doubling the first violin, and they don't have the retake. So is this an example like the previous one, where the violas are sort of covering for the first violins? If so, then why do the first violins have the retake? Well, that's a good question. The first violins have accent on the retake, and the violas, as you can see, no accent. The first violins again have overbowing, as they do before. So it's full of fascinating conundrums. And the first violins get into that second bar, again, with a grace note. But here, he asks for another down bow. Is that really what he wants? Now, perhaps this is an instance of a slur not being a slur. It could be a slur that's not a slur. There's one in the next bar, yeah? A slur that he marks down up. So is it just an omission here? I honestly don't know the answer. If we remind ourselves that it's an expression, then we can say, look, it could be that he wants that real weight. Can I match that? Pretty close. So maybe I do it on an up bow, mindful of the fact that it was meant to be a down bow. Different players will come to different views on these, but they are intentionally these sort of contradictory usage of markings for both expressive and practical purposes. But often, if you stick with one long enough, it can add something. So for instance, just a couple bars later in the actual cello part, I get to play a cello part. He marks a retake there. In what seems like incredibly sustained music. And to put all these gaps in for these retakes, that's asking a lot. And Mahler says at this point, etwas drängend, so that the music should be speeding up, driving forwards. Doing a retake for a string player takes time, yeah? So it's not easy to sustain intensity with retakes, and it's even more difficult to sustain intensity with retakes when we're speeding up, because you tend to be behind when you're doing retakes. But as you'll see in the clip of the orchestra, when Jolie does this and we do speed up, there's something phenomenally intense about the way, if you really are determined to save the bow and do a lightning fast retake, it's amazingly exciting. So, well, I hope that's not too much inside baseball for today. And I really hope that you're finding this of some interest and some entertainment value. Do be sure to check out the complete performance by my colleagues in the English Symphony Orchestra. The link is down below in the description. Please do subscribe to the YouTube channel. And if you're enjoying this stuff, do make a little donation to the ESO so we can keep the music playing. More to come. Thanks very much.